Grace to you and peace from God the Father and from our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. It happened at noon one day outside of a village in Samaria called Sychar, and I want to stop first and say that a village is not like Byron, a white spot in the road, but rather a village here is a significant-sized city. In those days and age, a Fairborn-sized city, we would not be considered significant today. But 30,000 people was the population of some of the major ancient cities. So this was a big city in Samaria, up on the top of the mountains. And there a footsore Jewish rabbi from Galilee named Jesus met an unnamed Samaritan woman by a very famous well, Jacob's well, and asks her for a drink. What follows is the longest recorded conversation in the Bible between Jesus and another person. You didn't know that, did you? You can mark that down as something you learned today. So. It's not only the longest, it's also probably the strangest. It's stranger even than the conversation that we read last week in chapter 3 of John between Jesus and Nicodemus. Jesus and his friends are traveling north from Jerusalem back up to Galilee. And even though it looks like it's the shortcut they're taking, let me assure you it is not. One route went down this way, which is the road from the Dead Sea. The other one went up the coastline. This is the way that Jesus and his disciples go, which looks like the shortest distance, but I assure you, no. It's like going from here to Cincinnati by way of Hillsboro. You have to have a reason to go from that straight line because the road looks like this all the way. It's on top of the mountain. It's very steep, it's very dangerous, it's dry, it's dusty, it's just a terrible place to travel, so nobody traveled there. There's other reasons too, by the way, why they didn't travel there. Because frankly, it was full of these people, Samaritans. And the Jews and the Samaritans had some difficulty getting along. In fact, the Samaritans were considered racially, religiously, socially inferior to the Jews. And the reason for this goes back 750 years before Jesus and this story. What happened was it's rooted in the fractured history of the two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. In 721 BC, the Assyrian Empire came down and destroyed the kingdom of Assyria, and they hauled away anybody that was worth anything. Those who could read and write, those who had property, those who had any religious or social significance. They took them all away, hauled them into exile. The reason they did this was they figured if they took all the intelligentsia away, there'd be nobody left to foment revolt. Now, the other thing is of course, they vanished from history. That's the 10 lost tribes of Israel. You've heard that phrase before, the 10 lost tribes. Well, as that was their habit, they then brought people in because when they conquered other places, they brought other folks in, and they brought into them a group of disparate aliens and settled them in the empty houses that existed around the capital of the northern kingdom, which was called Samaria. And those people who came in, who couldn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture. They had all these empty temples, all these empty public buildings. They did the best that they could to reestablish the religious and civil institutions. And what they ended up with was a kind of a hillbilly version of Judaism. Yeah, well, I'm from this part of the country, so just live with it, okay? It wasn't long before that southern group, the kingdom of Judah, who called themselves Jews, didn't care for that northern group at all, who called themselves Samaritans, having been, They considered that northern group as lazy, no good, irresponsible, smelly, untrustworthy miscreants that you could not abide. Once, when Jesus wanted to make a point about something to his followers, he told the story about a good Samaritan, which everybody knew was an oxymoron. The only good Samaritan was, there was no such thing as a good Samaritan, so that was the point. The disciples find themselves in Samaria, and they are not at all happy about being there. Not only is it Samaria, but it's noon, and they're hot, and they're hungry. And so they decide to go to the nearest town, because this well was outside of town. And I'll explain that to you in a second. They decide to buy some lunch, and they leave Jesus sitting there by himself. Outside of town seemed like an okay thing. But what happens is a Samaritan woman approaches, and she's carrying her water jar. Nobody expected her to be there at noon. And Jesus strikes up a conversation with her. Turns out to be every bit as convoluted as the one he just had with Nicodemus in the previous chapter. He says to her, "Hey, I'm thirsty. How about a drink?" I'm paraphrasing here, okay? She counters, "You talking to me? Jews don't drink with Samaritans. They don't even share the same cups with Samaritans." That's all true, by the way. He says, well, if you give me some of your water, I will give you living water. Now, in that day and age, living water meant water that was moving, sweet water, that came from a spring or a brook. Not the kind of stale, metallic-tasting water that you get out of a well that you've dug deep into the ground. But see, here's the problem. Old Jacob's well, which is where they were, that was fed by a spring. The water was cold and sweet. That's why people would travel outside the village to go to the well. So it was, in fact, living water, and like old Nicodemus, who couldn't understand what Jesus meant when he talked about the wind, she doesn't get it when she talks about the water, and she says, hey, you don't even have a bucket. This well is deep. How are you going to get some of that living water? And that's when Jesus tries to explain the metaphor to her. He says, the water I'll give you is water that you'll drink only once, and then you will never thirst again. To which she responds, well, I'll have me some of that. Now, they continue to banter about religion and her marital status, which, by the way, she lies about. And I find this is one of those points of truth, that people who have skeletons in their closets and come to their pastors to talk about problems, they never tell them the truth. They always fudge the truth. But he already knows about her past, doesn't he? And he tells her about her past, doesn't he? And at the end of the conversation, she concludes that she's going to be talking to some kind of a holy man. She says, I perceive you are a prophet. You've blown right through my facade. In fact, she thinks he might even be the Tahab, and that's a Samaritan version of the Messiah. The Tahab meant the one who would restore things. It's about this time that the disciples come back with lunch, and when they see Jesus talking with this Samaritan woman, it says they were astonished. No, the Greek word is horrified. They were horrified. Let me explain why. They are horrified because Jews don't talk to Samaritans. They were horrified because Jews don't drink with Samaritans. They were horrified because rabbis don't talk to women. The law said that even if you took your wife out, you didn't introduce her to people. That's not the way, by the way, it works in my house. Different world, different values. To make matters worse, though, and infinitely worse, they could see what kind of a woman this was because of the time of day she was at the well. Because you see, the well was kind of the Match.com of its day. Isaac found his wife at a well. Moses found his wife at a well. And Jacob met Rachel when she came to this well, and he helped her water her sheep. And then, as the story goes, he gave her a kiss, and the rest, as you know, is history. So it is for good reason the disciples were horrified. Because even though nobody says it out loud, they realize they're dealing with something that has religious, political, social ramifications. I'm reminded of the lyrics of the song Between Judas and Jesus in Jesus Christ Superstar about Mary Magdalene, where Judas says, it's not that I object to her profession. She just doesn't fit in well with what you teach and say. That's what the disciples are saying. The woman, meanwhile, is so flustered by the conversation at all, she just walks away and leaves behind what is her most valuable possession, the water jar. Those didn't just fall off the shelf at Kroger. Those had to be made by hand. They were precious commodities passed down from one generation to the next. She leaves it behind. She runs back to the community. She becomes the world's first evangelist, telling everyone who will listen about her encounter with this remarkable rabbi, suggesting that he might not be the Samaritan Tahab, he might be the Jewish Messiah. More remarkably still, the townspeople believe her. They figure anybody could figure out her convoluted life had to know something. And they follow her back to Jesus, who is now engaged with some serious debate with his disciples. And then they do a very un-Samaritan-like thing. They invite him and the disciples to come and stay with him. And they do for 2 days. And the conversation goes on. And more Samaritans are converted. And that's your story. I think that Jesus made this inconvenient detour into Samaria looking for that woman, or at least someone like her. Seeking an opportunity to teach by example what people could never figure out by word. A lesson in inclusion. Because the bottom line of this conversation he has with this woman of unquestionable character at Jacob's well, it ends up demolishing centuries of bigotry and religious exclusion. It's the same thing that happened in Montgomery, Alabama over 60 years ago when a black woman named Rosa Parks said she wasn't going to give up her seat on a bus to a white person. It changed the whole conversation. It turned the whole world on its head. We're still having that conversation, for better or for worse. Like her, Jesus did something that no one had ever done before. He enters into conversation with a person he was supposed to hate, that he was wired to hate. He demonstrates friendship and hospitality and love to a person who was a despised minority. And in that act, he challenges the fundamental organizing principle of his culture, of his religion, and of his world. He did it, I think, because usually the world uses religion to serve the causes of acceptance and unity, or I'm saying it's supposed to, but it doesn't. It uses it to divide and exclude us. And that's still going on today. This man, Senator Paul Simon, died about 10, 12 years ago. He was a Lutheran. Didn't know that, did you? Missouri Synod Lutheran, that's why you didn't know about it. See? Other tribe, you see. I had the wife of Missouri Synod Lutheran pastor here at early service, so I had to be careful about how I presented this. Because you see, you want to know what Samaritans and Jews are like today? Talk between the two branches of Lutheranism. Anyway, Paul Simon was once asked how his Missouri Synod Lutheran upbringing shaped his political views. This is what he said. He said, the leaders of my church thought that 95% of the people in heaven were Lutheran. My Catholic friends thought that heaven was reserved for Catholics. My Baptist chums were sure that heaven was a Baptist enclave. No one could even conceive of a Buddhist or a Muslim making it there, let alone a Jew. We didn't know any Buddhists or Muslims, but we had a Jewish neighbor. Her name was Mrs. Alexander, Mrs. A, I called her, and I used to help her do her ironing. She'd let me use this little ironing board she had made for her daughters, and then she'd give me cookies and milk. Hard to forget that. My father was not crazy about the ironing part, but he was okay with the cookies and milk. When my Lutheran friends told me one day that Mrs. A was going to hell, that's when I experienced my first theological crisis. I ran home crying, and I asked my mother if it were true. And Paul Simon said, no pastor ever spoke clearer truth to me than my mother did when she said, do you believe for a moment that a loving God would send Mrs. A to hell? No, I didn't. And no, I still don't. With a distressing frequency, religion, Christianity in particular, has come to the same conclusion, that our tribe has God's undivided attention and other tribes are going to hell. And the result of that kind of thinking, by the way, has some monuments around the world. They've got names: Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald. I don't have to invent this stuff. It already exists. Today, Islam represents the most immediate target for this kind of thinking. Our politicians intone radical Islamic terrorists. Okay, I get it. Jesus wants you to remember other stereotypes that once defined us: Samaritan, Gentile. Those were not meant as compliments. When Jesus transcends the theological boundaries of his religion and welcomes a Samaritan woman, they were not part of his ordered world, and then calls his followers to do the same, he is turning that ordered world on its head. This story is not told to them. This story is told to you and to me right now in this day and age. The woman that Jesus met in the well wasn't just a Samaritan. She had a bit of moral ambiguity going on in her life. She comes to the well at noon for a reason, because women normally would carry water in the cool of the morning or in the cool of the evening, especially since this well was outside the village by some distance. She went at noon because she didn't want to meet the other women, because she couldn't deal with the other women, and they didn't want to deal with her. She was a social outcast even amongst the Samaritans. She'd have been quite at home in our world. 5 husbands? Pfft, who cares? Except the other 4 husbands, maybe, I don't know. But here's the thing, you see, the Jewish law, which the Samaritans ascribed to, only allowed 3 total. Jesus said she's had 5 Andres, which our Bible politely translates as husbands, because we can deal with a divorcee, see? But how do you deal with somebody who was divorced 3 times and then has lived with 3 other men? Because the Andre she's with right now isn't her husband, it's her lover. The one who's his sugar daddy, whatever the proper phrase is for it these days. She's the very definition of a loose woman, and probably has given up on any appearance of propriety. That's why she doesn't go to the well in the morning or in the evening. Frankly, it'd be hard to find a woman more marginalized than she is, which is why the disciples were horrified when they saw Jesus talking to her. A promiscuous Samaritan woman. If she were a leper, the only way it could be worse. Yet, Jesus is not put off, not intimidated in the least. He relates to her with a steady, amazing, unconditional acceptance that even astonishes her. No one has ever treated her that way, privately or publicly. And when she tries to explain it to the townspeople, she says, he's told me everything I have ever done, and they knew what she had done. That's why they were so blown away. Wait a minute. Say that again? Everything? We know who you are. This guy tells you he's still talking to you? He's a Jew? Wait. We got to see this for ourselves. And she began to change. For the first time in her life, someone got past her outrageous behavior and addressed the person that she truly was. So I like to think of this as a love story. Because only somebody who loves you will take the time to know you for who you are and still stick with you. Only one who loves you, upon learning your darkest secrets, will look past them without blinking and find you worthy of their time and their effort and a good conversation. The story begins with an inconvenient detour. It ends with a miracle. We meet a woman thirsty for acceptance and forgiveness and inclusion. Perhaps you know what that's like. Perhaps you, like her, have felt ignored or marginalized. Perhaps you don't measure up to someone else's expectations, or worse, you don't measure up to your own. Perhaps you've experienced rejection, or like that woman, you've lived your life on the edge of polite society, skirting conventional thinking, eschewing the orthodox, flirting traditional values. Perhaps you found yourself living outside the boundaries of a community that you want to claim as your own, but you just can't. If that's who you are, if that's where you've ever been, well, I invite you to come forward today and drink from the living water. For the present and risen Lord Jesus Christ, who comes to talk to you at this well, at this table, with the bread and the wine. And know that you are loved by the same one who accepted and loved that Samaritan woman. Her conversion did not happen because Jesus criticized her or judged her or recommended changes or placed demands upon her life. It happened because he loved and accepted her. That love changed her. And if you let it, it'll change you too. And maybe, just maybe, we can become people who look beyond racial background and beyond religious differences and beyond politics and beyond moral ambiguity and see what Jesus sees. A child of God. Someone worthy of his conversation. Someone worthy of his life on a cross. She became an ambassador, a spokesperson, a witness, an evangelist. She became something she had never been before. Whole.
Take